So in this module, we're going to talk about conscious experience. And consciousness actually consists of a couple different pieces. We know that because of research on sleep and dreaming, which we'll talk about. We know this because of investigations into recreational drugs such as LSD and magic mushrooms, which we'll also talk about. And lastly, we know because of altered states of consciousness like meditation, highway hypnosis, and a few other things. Let's talk about consciousness. So consciousness is defined as the combination of a person's subjective experience of the external world and your mental activity. So that combination of what you're thinking and what you're experiencing in front of you results from brain activity. So your brain is always interpreting whatever's going on around you. At the very beginning of this course, I was mentioning that most psychologists actually do not believe that the mind and the brain are two separate things. That's called dualism, as suggested by René Descartes during the Renaissance. Instead, most psychologists follow the idea of materialism, that the mind and the brain are actually inseparable, and that it's the brain activity of your brain processing information around you that results in experiences like thoughts, feelings, and things like that. And in fact, we know that there are different levels of consciousness. So in fact, when you first get into a class that you're really excited about and you've been waiting for, or maybe you just went to go see a movie that you were really excited about, you're awake, you're alert. But actually, I have the problem where when I go to a movie theater, it's basically a nap I'm going to pay for. So I'm going to fall asleep within an hour of almost every movie. My kids even prepare for it. They know that I'm going to fall asleep. So as I start to fall asleep, I'm moving into a different level of consciousness. And in fact, you're familiar with this because you've been reading along in the textbook, I'm sure, already in this course, and you've lost track of what you were reading, and you either went back and reread it, hopefully, or maybe you continued on, not actually going back to review what you were just reading. Maybe you've had the experience of highway hypnosis, where you've been driving down the road, not been paying attention consciously to what was going on, and then all of a sudden it's like your brain suddenly wakes up 10 miles, 5 miles, or 30 minutes later, and you realize you don't remember what's been happening or how long it's been. These experiences tell us that there are different levels of consciousness. And in fact, that unconscious level of processing allows us to function. When you experience highway hypnosis, the reason you don't just crash is because your brain has this autopilot that is allowing you to drive the car. You can do some of those basic functions, just like typing or riding a bike. You are able to do some of these things automatically without having to think about it. That is the idea of subliminal perception. That is perception of information that is below your conscious awareness, right? It's subliminal, sub meaning below, and liminal meaning in your conscious awareness. So it's below your level of conscious awareness. So we can present materials to participants subliminally. We can slightly alter their feelings or what they're thinking by playing certain music in the background they're not paying attention to. That's one of the reasons we tend to pair specific songs with car commercials, for example, because the particular song results in an emotional reaction that allows you to more likely sort of be interested and maybe invest or even buy in that car. Now, psychologists can actually examine and we can even measure consciousness and other levels of other kinds of mental states that we used to think were too subjective, right? You may think, well, how do I know if someone's aware? How do I know if the person next to me in a movie theater is aware? Well, that may be because they're able to talk to you, right? They're able to explain what their subjective experience is about. Now, that's not to say that we all have the exact same set of subjective experiences. If you don't believe me, one study asked married couples what percentage of the housework that they each do. What's fascinating about studies like this is that consistently, couples in romantic relationships say that they do more. They do 75% on average. Okay, so clearly they're having two different subjective experiences, and not both of them can be accurate. So we view things differently based on our own mental state. But we can, like the example I just gave with married couples, we can investigate those. We can measure those differences, and then we can start to describe where some of those differences come from. One of the most common models for explaining consciousness is what we call the global workspace model. In the global workspace model, consciousness is really a product of activity in different brain regions. So there's not any one single area of your brain that makes you aware. So if you have that area, you're conscious, and if you don't have that area, you're not. In fact, each different area of your brain is responsible for a different part of your consciousness. Let's take a look at this. So in this graphic, what you can see is that the different parts of your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, primary motor cortex, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe each do different things. Your prefrontal cortex tells you that you can understand plans. Here's what's happening. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how early I need to leave the house to meet my friend for lunch. Your primary motor cortex tells you your conscious experience of where your hands are and where you're moving. So it's what directs you if you need to perform some routine that you've got to think about. That's your primary motor cortex that's consciously allowing you to make those movements. So in fact, people with Parkinson's disease, where their primary motor cortex starts to not send signals effectively to lower brain areas, they actually lose the ability to gain conscious motor movement. So they may be telling themselves to walk or to stop walking, but their brain is slow to respond because they are essentially losing some conscious control over that movement. Your parietal lobe is what tells you where your body's located in space. If you ever watched, there was an old show on FX about some plastic surgeons, and a guy came in and described how the arm that was attached to him was not his arm and he wanted to amputate it. He did not identify it as being part of his own. We believe that, now those cases are pretty rare, but we believe that when that happens, and there are some real world examples of this happening, sometimes called devil's hand or the evil hand syndrome, we believe that that is a malfunction in the parietal lobe, or it's a difference in the parietal lobe where you're not aware that that hand is your own or that arm is your own. Your occipital lobe is what allows you your conscious sense of vision. So if you lose your occipital lobe, you're not consciously aware that you can see anymore. You are effectively blind. You actually can detect movement and a few other things, but you don't have any conscious sense that you can see things. And lastly is the temporal lobe. Similar to the occipital lobe, it gives you your conscious experience of hearing. And in fact, actually, one of the earliest experiments that told us that you have different levels of consciousness and that your brain processes different kinds of consciousness differently are a series of what are called split brain experiments. In a split brain experiment, these are cases where patients usually have really severe, uncontrollable seizures. The seizures actually spread from one side of the brain to the other. In order to control these seizures, we will cut a part of their brain called the corpus callosum that you may remember from the last module. The corpus callosum is surgically cut, which results in their two hemispheres, their two halves of their brain, not being able to send information effectively from one side to the other. So just as the brain has been split in two, so has their conscious mind. Each part of their vision actually views and does different things. And this actually told us that your brain is specialized, your left and right half of your brain are specialized for particular things. Now you may have heard in the past that your left side of your brain is for art and creativity, and your right side of your brain is for math and rationalization and reason. That's actually, there's no evidence to support that, but most of those claims come from these kinds of experiments. So here's what's different about your left and right half of your brain. So here's your corpus callosum in red. You can see where it's been. So on the one side here is somebody with an intact corpus callosum. Right here, the nose and eyes are up here. We just cut this. This connects the upper part of their brain, so the cerebral cortex. You can see in this patient, it's been cut and it's no longer there, so it's not functional. So that's somebody who's got a split brain treatment. So the hemispheres normally work very well together, sending information back and forth, but once they're separated, they no longer send signals. This allows us to test these ideas about these two hemispheres and what they each do. So, a couple things to remember. Your right hemisphere generally is better at processing spatial relationships. It processes information from your left visual field. So your right side of your brain processes information from your left side, and it tends to control movements on your left side. Your left hemisphere, on the other hand, tends to control movements on the right side of your body and your right visual field. Okay? So, what we do is we take patients that have had a split brain procedure. We show to the left hemisphere We show a picture of a fork here, which is coming from the left hemisphere on the right side, so they can see the fork here. Their left hemisphere controls verbalization, so they can speak, so they can tell you, oh, that's a fork. But if you have them reach behind the screen to grab the fork, they cannot. But when you show on the right side, when you show the spoon, right, they cannot say what it is. They cannot say, oh, that's a spoon. But when they reach underneath, now they're not looking, and they reach underneath the screen, they can identify the spoon by touch. That tells us that your left hemisphere seems to be better at processing language. Your right hemisphere seems to be better at processing touch, right, or spatial relationships.